Professor Thomas Barfield, thank you ever so much for coming on the show to share your stories and your thoughts of Afghanistan. You're, of course, one of the preeminent scholars on Afghanistan. So I'm so grateful for you to giving me your time all the way from Boston.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
You've got such a long history with the country, over 5 decades. And, 1972, first time you went to Afghanistan. But I want you to
1971.
1971, I'm wrong on that. So 1971, you went to Afghanistan. I just wanted to know what happened in 1969 and 70 that made you think about, yeah, there's this country called Afghanistan I want to go to.
It was actually pure serendipity. My college roommate, the summer before, the summer of 1970, had traveled to Iran and Afghanistan. And he came back and he described the country, the people, how interesting it was. And at that time, American university students usually thought about going to Europe for the summer. That was sort of a big thing. We'll get a lot of charter flights. But I thought that's a little boring. I could do more than that, but I didn't know really anything beyond sort of the borders of Europe in my mental map. But I felt if my roommate had done it, it couldn't be that hard to do. Um, and so I got a charter flight to the UK, crossed the channel and hitchhiked from, I think, Amsterdam to Istanbul, which was an adventure in itself, hitchhiking. That was very common at that time. And when I arrived in Istanbul, what I discovered was a regular route that there were people from Australia traveling to Europe, but there were mostly a lot of Europeans, very few North Americans because we're more distant, going to India, going to Nepal, to Kathmandu. So it turned out
The
that
hippies.
yeah, it was a so-called hippie trail, rather pejorative term. Um, but it's hard to believe now, but this was a completely easy overland route that you could catch buses, trains, um, and there were even people that would buy buses in Germany, Mercedes buses, and then take passengers all the way to India where they would sell the bus. Um, so you could get a really cheap, good
Mm.
ride because the profit was in selling the bus. But even if you didn't do that, anytime you got to a new city, there would be people waiting at the bus to try to take you to a hotel room. But beyond that, to sell you sort of a ticket, take you to the sarai that would take you to the next
Yeah.
place. So I traveled very, very quickly with a group of people, a group of foreigners that stupidly bought a bus ticket from Istanbul to Erzurum because the agent told us it was only 24 hours. And I thought, that's good because the train is 48. And then I discovered that actually people don't tell the truth because who would buy a bus ticket uh, that was going to be 3 days? But we
Yeah.
had already bought the bus ticket. They put all the foreigners in the back and we became this little cohesive group. Very interesting group. There was a German doing his Wanderjahr who literally had a notebook with the prices of everything from Germany to India. Okay, so every got to the border, we were never cheated on what's the price of a Pepsi Cola, what's the price of the next
That is
route.
German efficiency for you.
Incredibly, yes. So he was good. He was also named Thomas. And then there was an American drug smuggler based in Berlin who was on his way to Peshawar, where he would buy hashish and give it to an American military non-commissioned officer who would strap it to his body and jump onto an American military transport flight because there was no customs, and it would hopscotch back to Europe, and he had raced back to Germany to buy it and sell it. So he explained to me how the drug trade worked. So I say a very interesting group of people, but they were moving very fast. And when I first arrived in Afghanistan and arrived in the city of Herat after coming from the very noisy city of Mashhad,
Mm.
which was full of light, full of noise, full of Shia pilgrims. I mean, and the Shah had his modern Iran. To arrive the next evening in Herat, and there were very few electric lights. The streets were barely paved. and all I could hear was the clip clop of horses pulling gadis, those little
Yeah,
horse
yeah,
carts, as the sun went down, and I could hear the call to prayer. And it was just so different. And so I decided, well, I should stay in this place a little bit more. My friends continued on. No, they were heading to Delhi and Kathmandu. And I decided I would explore Afghanistan. I knew nothing about Afghanistan, zero. And so it was pure experience there. But there were people who could speak English, so you could move along. And within 6 or 8 weeks, I had a little bit of elementary Persian because I had never, when you study language in the university, you take exams. Okay.
yeah,
It's all negative reinforcement. But I never tried to learn a language where there was positive reinforcement. Learn the name of a new food and they give it to you.
yeah.
Um, Learn a little bit more and you can engage in conversation. And Persian grammar is relatively simple compared to like Pashto. Um, so I found myself in a short period of time, not very good, but enough rudimentary Farsi to, you know,
Yeah.
handle more things, answer a few questions. But in Kabul, I ran into a fellow American whose father was a congressman, and we managed to get from the embassy a letter to the Afghan tourist organization allowing us to, or recommending that we be allowed to hike into Nuristan.
Ah,
And
so you
I
left
did,
Herat and went to Kabul. I just, how did you
yes.
find, because for people who know Afghanistan, Herat, if you've been to Iran, and then Herat is a kind of a, because of the cultural linkages and the shared history, I suppose, you'll not be extraordinarily out of place in Herat.
Mhm.
But going further towards east, and how did you find Afghan? You will probably not experience Afghanistan as Afghanistan until you reached Kandahar. Yeah.
Yeah, but I only had lunch in Kandahar. It was the middle of summer in Kandahar. I arrived at the middle. It was really hot. There was a lot of flies, and we were out of Kandahar, and I was in Kabul for the evening. So my experience in Kandahar was lunch.
and
Um,
and and how was Kabul at the time? So 71 Kabul.
it was really interesting. I arrived at the old post office. That's where the buses came in.
Hmm.
And there were immediately little kids that, you know, got commissions to bring us to hotels.
Yeah.
Uh, so they took us to an Afghan hotel, and it was the hotel next to the Puli Hishti Mosque on the river.
Yeah.
And it was a good price. It was 20 afs a night, all right, which was at the time there were 100 afs to the dollar, so that was like 20 cents.
Yeah.
Um, and it had a nice restaurant in it with Afghan food. Um, I mean, common toilets and stuff. It was just a bare
Yeah.
room.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and so that was the first part of Afghanistan that I saw. And of course, in the middle of the Shore Bazaar, so I wandered around that. I did not know at that time that Shari now existed. That's where most of the foreigners were. I didn't even know that existed. So I
Yeah.
was living in a real sort of old Afghan part of town where I met these people. And then once we got permission to go to, we were so stupid that we had an Afghan tourist map and we wanted to go to Nuristan because we had heard about Nuristan. And only the tourist map, it had a little place that said Nuristan on it.
Yeah.
Well, that's not exactly Nuristan. That's Pashai territory, not,
Yeah.
we were thinking Kamdesh, but we pointed to Nuristan. Said, okay, you can go there. So we went to Jalalabad and then we went uh, back up to the beginning of the Alingar Valley.
Yeah.
And we met a last local government official who was sitting in this small building listening to parliamentary debates on the radio. And he could speak English. So he saw the document that we had, and he arranged for this guy to take us up. He said, we'll take you up 10 days, bring you back. I still remember his name. His name was Ali Mehmet, and he was close to 2 meters high. I mean, he was really tall, very skinny. And then my friend got sick. So he said, dysentery, he says, I can't go, but we're going this far. So, you should continue. So I did. And so literally, when we talk about difference,
Mm.
you go in up the Alangar Valley into Pashai territory. That's where the buildings are built on, cliffs
Yeah.
and typical Nuristani architecture. The women do the agriculture and they have these conical baskets. And we kept going higher and higher into one. I realized I was probably close to, we'd gone one more mountain range of what I would into the pond shears. I mean, I didn't know where I was. We just went higher and higher. And Ali Mehmet didn't believe in following little trails, that
Yeah.
linked back. He would just go straight up. And one time he took where right above the Alangar River, and there's a side trail around a cliff. And literally, I would say, the path is less than a half meter. And
Mm.
you hold on to the rock and crawl around it. And I kept reminding myself it was 100 meters down, don't fall. But that saved like a half a day. So we're up. I would give Ali Mehmet, before he got to the village, 50 halves so they could buy a chicken. I mean, mountain communities don't have traditions of hospitality. I mean,
Yeah.
they're nice people, but they're too poor to have that kind of thing, particularly if you want a chicken. So we would buy a chicken and then share it with the people that ate. And so that was my real introduction to Afghanistan, which is not a typical introduction to Afghanistan. I didn't realize how unusual the ability to hike 10 days up the Alangar Valley was. That's not a usual tourist kind of thing. So when I came out, and at that time, Afghanistan was experiencing a drought. So they were having these various village meetings about irrigation and other types of things. Went up, 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 and then took a donkey trail on the other side of the river down, which I realized later had probably been built by Abdur Rahman,
Mm.
because I believe he was hoping that the Russians, if they chose to invade India, would
Yeah.
come that way and avoid Kabul. So I came back to Kabul. Took me about 4 or 5 days to recover. And went to Mazar Sharif, saw the shrine there, came back from Mazar, and that's when I went to Bamyan. But I went to Bamyan from, I guess it's the town of Doshi.
Mm.
And if you go to the left, it goes up to the Salang Pass. But if you go straight ahead is the old pass
Okay.
to those shots. So I first got a ride on an oil truck, and they had put 2 boards on the side of the tank so that you wouldn't fall off.
Yeah.
And we got to one of the first sarais, and the guy felt sorry for me, so he found me a truck hauling cotton the next day.
Mm.
So we arrived in the Hazarajat, I mean, in Bamyan itself, coming in from the north, which was a little unusual. And that's when I spent a few days in Bamyan, sat on the head of the Bamyan Buddha, climbed up Shari Gogala, fell off, almost killed myself
Oh
rolling
no.
down the hill. Yeah, well, it was, yeah, but it was okay. And caught a ride with some Germans that had a VW bus that went to Bandimir. So we
Mm.
spent time in Bandimir for a few days and then came back to Bamyan. And again, I decided that I would take an unusual route back, and I went back to Kabul via Yakolang and Panjau. So I
Yeah.
got to see, again, a rather unusual part of Afghanistan, taking these trucks back. And the last truck, they had bought a lot of goats, and they'd taken all these poplar poles to build sort of a cage on top. We sat on top of the poplar poles. The goats were below us. By this time, I had a pretty bad case of dysentery, and we arrived back in Kabul. So a few days
That
later,
is
I left.
quite an
Back.
extraordinary journey. I mean, you know,
Yeah, for a sort of 8 week. Yeah, it was particularly for a person that knew nothing,
and I mean,
literally nothing about Afghanistan. So by the time when I left, I decided Afghanistan was a really interesting place. I was trained to be an archaeologist. And it was my experience in Afghanistan that I decided living people were more interesting than dead ones. And also my experience, I could, rudimentary communication, but belief that, yeah, that that was doable too. Archaeologists normally don't learn local languages. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not what they. Um, and I was also interested in pastoral nomads, intellectually, and Afghanistan had a lot of them. So I thought it's a really interesting place, and
And then
I sh
you went back to Afghanistan, lived with coachees, I suppose, in northern Afghanistan. And I was thinking
yeah.
about, how was life like with, studying them, of course, you became part of their lives to get to know them.
Yes, that's true. They were a different kind of. They don't like the term coochie, never
Mm,
have. They like the term maldar,
okay.
people, livestock. But most people in Afghanistan, because that's the majority of them, Coochies, they think of Pashtun Coochies, Baluch with these black goat hair tents.
Yeah.
The people that I lived with were these Central Asian Arabs, and they didn't speak Arabic, they spoke Persian, but they came out of a Central Asian yurt tradition. All right, so they didn't use black tent. They had different kinds of tents. They had culturally they were Central Asian, which is not surprising. Their history, they had been living in Samarkand until the Russians invaded.
Yeah.
And when the Russians invaded and occupied Samarkand, they moved to Afghanistan. Um, the emirs of Afghanistan were inviting refugees from Central Asia, sort of fleeing Russia. And the Russians had directly occupied Samarkand. Bukhara was independent, it was it was a client state, but it was independent. So they were granted land in Afghanistan or the right to do pasture. So they moved there. So their traditions were Central Asian. But yeah, but one of the things was um, they were granted land in the 1920s. And so their winter villages were actually their kashlaks, their winter village, were traditional sort of paksa and mud brick of villages. In the spring and summer, they got their tents out and they moved to the Dasht and then to the mountains. So in the winter, they look very similar to most other villages in the neighborhood, although there were a few that lived in tents year round. But yeah, it was a very intense kind of thing. I had a good Afghan friend who made the introductions. You just don't walk into a place and have that happen. You don't ask the government to do it either. So I was his friend. He made the arrangements. He was the chief engineer of the Spinzar Cotton Company in Imam
Yeah.
Sahib. And so, he arranged, he was my sponsor for that. He was a Pashtun too. Um, and was working with these Arabs. But yeah, the relationships go for a long time. It must have been what, 10 years ago? I actually got a telephone call for them and they wanted my email address and gave them the email address. And they explained that the younger brother, I met him when in 2001. He was a very handsome guy in his 20s, but I was there when he was born. Um, had been kidnapped, and these people had called the police, and they'd actually gotten the brother released, gotten released from the kidnapper, but the kidnapper was killed. The kidnapper's widow was apparently very powerful, so she had the elder brother thrown in jail,
Mm.
and they couldn't get him out. So they got a hold of me and said, you know, he's in jail. And they said, Afghan jail, not an American jail. Um, can you get him out? Um, and fortunately, one of my Afghan students had a lot of connections in Kunduz province, particularly, and a number of his relatives were high up in Kabul too. They made a call to Kunduz and said, "Is this guy in jail?" And they said, "No, he's not in jail. Like, let him out." And then I got a nice email back saying that, yeah, he's out of jail, and it's really good that you were able to help us out. And the person that had the Gmail account was saying, my mother often talked of you and your wife, but I never met you. And I think, of course, because you weren't born. Um, but that's the kind of thing in Afghanistan that literally 30 years after I was there, I went back to see them in 2002, 2006, but um, they felt, I had an obligation to help them out. Whether I could do it or not, that was another thing. I
Yeah.
was fortunate to be able to do it. But yeah, that's the way things work in Afghanistan, and I certainly owed them the obligation, to try. So it's that kind of thing. I owed much more to them when I
Mm.
was doing my work. I was a poor graduate student. I was not connected with anybody. 40 years later, I had much more influence and whatnot. If I could use that, then
Mm.
it was my job to do it.
But
So that's
your from your initial introduction to Afghanistan, I mean, you experienced Afghanistan's colored tapestry of communities of people, from Nuristan to to Persian speaking people in Herat, to Nuristan, to Pashtuns of Kandahar, uh,
Hazaras
to
and
Hazaras, and then to
Bamyan and
and
Yakolang. And
yeah.
Yakolang, actually, linguists told me that's a Mongolian name from when the Mongols were there. So
But as
one,
I'm a Hazara.
yeah,
Do tell me about your first initial encounters. I mean, I had people asking me, sending me messages about. I did a tweet yesterday saying I'm interviewing Professor Barfield. What is it that you want to know? And some of them, being Hazaras, and some of them none, sent their ideas and what they wanted to know, and people praised, oh, how much I love his work. But there's a kind of, being a Hazara, there's a sense of romanticism about, your people facing a foreigner for the first time, or a foreigner facing your people for the first time. How was your encounters with the Hazara for the first time? You spoke about the Nuristanis, for example.
one of the things you have to realize that my first encounters, I didn't know the differences between these two people or
Mm.
all these people. I learned them later. To me, they were all Afghans. To even think about that the term Afghan might be problematic, it was just they were all people, and it was only in retrospect that I could go back. For example, probably the first Hazara um, that I remember. Well, not the first, because when I was in Bamyan, of course, it was all Hazaras, and when we were in Bondimir, it was.
Mm.
But if you couldn't talk with the people or interact, you didn't. And I was moving through very fast.
Yeah.
Uh, but I got a real feel for the environments in which they live. Also, I could see the physical differences, obviously, that I was seeing in Bamyan than I was in Western Nuristan. Very
Yeah.
different. Or coming back from Mazar, where they've got more Uzbeks and others. But the bigger thing was, I noticed people dress differently. It would be only later that I realized a lot of ethnicity in Afghanistan is how people present themselves.
Yeah.
Uh, but for me, at the first time, it's just sort of a kaleidoscope. Uh, but when I came back, and this was in '73, to begin my research, I was in Kabul, and I was staying in a hotel near Cherai Ansari. It was
Mm.
owned by an Afghan general, so he was probably Pashtun. But a lot of the serving staff was Hazara. And later I realized, yeah, if somebody's called Ali, he probably is. But
Yeah.
his Pashai people were, Ali Mehmet, I remember, I'm pretty sure he was Sunni. But we had servants there and stuff that sort of that was the Kabul Hazara community, which is very different than just like when I spent a lot of time in Badakhshan. The
Yeah.
villages in Badakhshan are quite different than um, Persian speakers that live in cities. So I would learn through that. And one of my colleagues at that time, an American, was uh, was a Muslim convert. So people took a lot of, and I I got his, I collected his stuff. I mean, when he was looking for Sufis, he was a religious seeker, and he was also a student of Gurdjieff, the Russian
Mm.
sort of philosopher. And so he went all the way up to the end of the Panjshir Valley because there was some myth that there were these enlightened Sufis there. Well, it turned out
Yeah.
no, there were no enlightened Sufis there. Right? Anyway, he was up there, but he was up there during the coup that Daoud threw out the king. And
Yeah.
so Kabul was kind of on lockdown at the time. They didn't want foreigners running around. So they sent the police out to arrest him. Um, and they brought him back, and this was the old Afghanistan. So they made him pay for the trip back. But as long as the foreigner was paying, they were stopping at every chai khana to have kebab and tea, in which they explained that they had arrested this foreigner and he was an American Muslim. Whoa. And, so it's like, anyway, we got, the next time I saw him, he's surrounded by Afghan police coming to my hotel room because I'm holding his stuff.
Yeah.
And now they decide he's a spy. So he said, well, there's my stuff, which is a backpack. So they open the backpack, and on top is a Quran. And they take it out. There were 5 Qurans there. I mean, he may have been a spy, but this was so. They took him to Damazan prison, and they heard, wow, we have an American Muslim spy. So they held a feast for him. They finally took him to the Afghan border and told him, Burro, like go across.
Just go.
But that was the weird kind of stuff so when I was 2 weeks later, I was robbed in Sharinal Park.
Oh.
Well, it wasn't that bad. The guy just stopped me in the dark and wanted my money. And I had just changed money. So I had a large wad of 100 Afghani notes, but it was the moonlight. So he wasn't a very good thief. I pulled my money out and I start looking at it and I go, 10, 10, 10. And then I realized, wait a minute, I don't have any 10s. These are all hundreds. So I just handed him one. And then I said, okay, well, I've given you 100. I want your hat. He says, you can't have my hat because I hope to identify him later.
You're haggling with a thief in Kabul.
So he tells me to Bora Bora. Anyway, I find some police and said I was just robbed. And I said it was by a policeman. And they said, well, how do you know it was police? I said, because he was in a police uniform. They said, well, anybody can buy a police uniform. Anyway, we went to look for him. And the next day I went to the police station. They said, pick out somebody, we'll arrest them. So they had a lot of people, but, I said I didn't recognize any. But as I'm walking in, he said, where are you staying? I said, I'm staying at the Omar Hotel. And he says, Omar Hotel, that's where all the good American Muslims stay. We'll find your thief, we'll arrest him, no trouble. Again, I couldn't arrest him. I'd only lost 100 apps, but, but that was it was a very different kind of environment.
Well, Professor, you've really neatly brought us to what I want to talk about next, is the whole idea of Afghanistan and the idea of, the Afghan state, its existing, its being, I suppose. In the book and in other places you've spoken about, the writ of Afghan state did not extend beyond the cities, the perimeters of the cities that they were in.
Right.
But the whole myth that Afghanistan is this homogeneous nation that is of one, that has got a centralized state that is powerful, that is in charge, has never been true in any sense. Reading your book, Afghanistan, a cultural and political history, many years ago, I read the first edition. And, what I got out of the book was this strong sense of this country does not work because there's this foundational imbalance in its founding story, where there is one tribe who aims to rule and conquer other ethnic groups, whilst at the same time fighting amongst themselves to continue to carry on with that power. Now, how would you characterize Afghanistan as a country, the whole idea of Afghanistan?
Well, it's what we have to go back is that we're colored by nationalism. And nationalism wants to tell a story about some kind of common unity, some kind of common origin. At which point the uncomfortable facts of history mean, well, what do you do about those other people? Turkey talks about the importance of Turkish culture. What do you do about the Kurds? What do you guys do to the Armenians? How come you got rid of the Greeks who had been there for 3,000 years? Or Iran, talking about, this is under the Shah, talking about the importance of Persian culture in it, all its dynasties before the Pahlavis, going back to the Seljuks, are Turks. So this is a really interesting region in which you have dominant, often minority groups, militarily powerful conquerors ruling these places, but they sit on top of a much more complex situation. And if you look at it, again, what I've said is that whether it's Pashtuns, whether it's Turks, why was it that the Persian language, Persian styles of bureaucracy remain the same, all the way back to the Seljuks? Is that you want to run an administration, you do it in Persian and you hire Persian bureaucrats. You look at the Mughal Empire, which starts in Kabul, all right, rules India. Babur is a Turk, and yet he runs his empire in Persian. You know, we normally assume if it's a dominant group, they're going to impose their language, their way of, that all positions will be theirs. It's never worked that way. And all of that, the region that Afghanistan is part of, but in other parts of the world, states kind of got rid of that. In Afghanistan, they never did. So there's always been relationships that the group that's politically dominant is not politically exclusive. And culture makes it. I don't know how many times, I think going back at least to Shir Ali, there's been attempts to run the Afghan government in Pashto, and they've all failed. One of the reasons is that Pashtuns, for example, who moved to Kabul, pretty soon, you know, Persian is their lingua franca. And just as Babur may have, you know, praised and patronized Turkish poets when it came to run the government, he hired people that ran it in Persian because the British said Persian is the French of the East. I mean, the early Ottoman sultans, they were all bilingual in Persian. Yeah. So these are nationalist views of history that we now have as each country, you know, no matter how new it is, like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, proclaims that they've always been there, that this is, you know, our home. But that isn't the way this area has ever operated. And the famous Kingdom of Kabul and its dependencies, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, actually commented on just what you said. He said, when you talk to the when you talk to the Shah in Kabul, actually he was talking to him in Peshawar, which was the winter capital. He says the government is described as the Shah rules everything. And he says, and the ulama will tell you that's true. He says, you go to local communities and they say, no, the Shah has no power here. And Elphinstone said, there's a contradiction in this view, which creates problems. So all the way back to the first British encounter with Afghanistan is these two rival descriptions of how things should run. Is one, the centralized state is in charge of everything, and one of the local communities is we handle all of our affairs. The interesting thing is that the local level, people recognize the importance of having a government. Who's going to take care of bandits? Who's going to deal with foreign relations? So they don't deny the state's sovereignty. What they do deny is willingness to follow its administration, which is kind of interesting, you know, is that a state should exist, but it should stay out of our business. That's not true in cities. States run that. Heavily irrigated agricultural areas, states run. But a good chunk of Afghanistan is not that way and never has been. And since Abdurrahman pulled it together in the 1890s and made it a singular state and just looked like he destroyed everything autonomous, it turned out that even his power was not enough to maintain it. Because when Amanullah says, I can do anything that I want as the ruler of Afghanistan, the country implodes and everything collapses. obviously there was another structure there that was far deeper.
Mm.
And what I would say, whether it was Amanullah, whether it was the communist, or whether it was Ashraf Ghani, failure to recognize that that structure exists has been the bane of governments that feel that they have a right to command everybody. That's sort of what the Taliban also believe. But if you believe that, then you're asking yourselves for trouble. Whereas the kings, like Zaire Shah and his father particularly, was, yeah, we claim to be in charge, but actually we don't do very much. And Dawood was kind of the same way. So when I was in Afghanistan at the local level, I didn't see government. When I went on, my wife and I went on the nomad migration from Kunduz all the way over to Darwaz, I never saw a single government official. And in Kabul, the Interior Ministry told me, now, every time you enter a new district, you should go to the police station and tell them you're there. And I thought, well, that's a good way to be arrested. So I never did. And nobody ever cared because they never saw an official. I mean, we were 7 days from the nearest road. An official would have to walk. There was an official that had heard that I was coming, who actually, for good reasons, was trying to find me. But he was the Mamuri Pist. He was in charge of tax collection for Pistachio. So no one would tell him because he's a tax collector, you know? And as everybody told me in the village, whenever an authority figure tells you something, lie. There's time for the truth if it turns out to be worthwhile. But, you know, it's what James Scott called, you know, sort of the ability of the resistance of the powers of the weak. And one of the ways is to make yourself invisible. It's very hard to exert power from a centralized state if, and this is still true in Afghanistan, you don't even have a census of the country.
No, you don't.
You don't.
But just on that, I mean, you know, the Afghanistan's the modern narrative, the modern story of Afghanistan is one of a Pashtun-centric story, correct?
Yes.
That is, we are the natural owners of this land. This country is ours. If you challenge this narrative in any way, you either go to Mongolia or go to Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. This has been, you know, I suppose the narrative that has also fed the undoing of Afghanistan as a country.
Mhm.
And in your writings, you've also talked about, which is, of course, as factors daylight in the country, this long time, decades and centuries old struggle between modernization of the cities and the pushback of the villages against them. So just talk about that a bit, because, you know, whatever juncture of history Afghanistan has been, any attempt of modernization has been faced by the revolt of the villages. And do you see the Taliban as just another incarnation of the villages' victory against the cities?
No, because the Taliban are modernists. They do not represent tradition because they're dictatorial. I mean, I said they're the twins of the PDPA, but with the opposite beliefs. But what they had in common with the PDPA is they know the truth and they will impose it on everyone. Right? So they are modernists. You know, they do not represent the victory of the villages. The other thing too, and states fail in their modernization because they try to impose it. But Afghanistan changes. And so it modernizes at its own pace. The villages of today are very different than the ones that I saw 50 years ago, let alone the ones that existed 100 years ago. Thing is, when people talk about tradition, they say this is the way we've always done things. If you could revive their grandfathers, they would say that does not look like how we did things. But they come around at their own pace to do it. So the past 20 years, more education in Afghanistan, more communication in Afghanistan, broader connections with the outside world. That has fundamentally changed Afghanistan. But one of the problems, and I would say not only the PDPA, not only the first Taliban, but even Ashraf Ghani, was, we don't negotiate with these people. We tell them what to do. And also, there was a tendency in Kabul, certainly in my time, and I think it existed under the Republic, for a certain amount of contempt for people who lived in the countryside. That they were an embarrassment. Why do these foreigners want to see these places? You know, they should see modern Kabul. If I want to see modern something, I could go to Paris or I could go to New York. And they were saying, these people, sometimes they would ask me when I was working with these nomads, with these rural people in Badakhshan, they would say, you spend the night there? I said, sure, they're very nice people. I said, I own land there, but I never spend the night there. You know, I'm afraid of those people. This is one of the things for me as a foreigner, kind of all Afghans were kind of alike in a way. And it fundamentally deep. I had to learn the differences. I know all of Afghan prejudices about each other, but they're not internal to me. They're learned. They don't even, you know, I know every group's complaint about every other group. All right. But to me, when I was looking at it, you know, you're actually pretty much the same. People say, how is that possible? We're not the same. But Afghans did learn how the same they were was when they went to Iran or they went to Pakistan during the Soviet war. They realized we're not Pakistanis. We're certainly not Iranians. Even the Hazaras who were Shias would say the kind of Shiism they do in Iran is not exactly how we would do it. Temporary marriage, and the Hazaras didn't do temporary marriage in Afghanistan. It's perfectly legal in Iran, but that's not our culture. So if we look at it, what we see is Afghans, I think, actually recognized in some senses the commonality they had amongst themselves when they were made refugees. Was all they could focus on was the differences when they were within the country. But that's because they never had any experience with, or I spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, I spent a semester or so in Samarkand. Same ethnic groups, Tajiks and Uzbeks. 70 years of Soviet experience in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Those people may be Uzbeks and Tajiks, but culturally they do not resemble people on the other side of the border at all. And they had a great fear of their co-ethnics on the other side of the border. They said these people are ni kulturni, the Russian kind of like, you know, they're too much into religion, you know, and they're too aggressive, and they're always looking to do business. Whereas the Soviet system, it kind of, for most of them, had beat the idea of entrepreneurship out of them. And I realized, even though culturally, if I'd gone back 100, 150 years, Central Asia, Northern Afghanistan would have been the same. No, they weren't. They were really, even though the ethnicity, you had co-ethnics across the border, they were different. So some of the things in terms of you know, Afghanistan is there's a common culture. It was, you know, is that the Juma Khan that I lived with, he had lymphoma type of cancer. He flew to Delhi to get treatment. When he came back to our village, he was, you know, showing sugar packets and plastic spoons they got from the plane, showing people like this, describing, you know, they had stewardesses on this thing, you know, they got short skirts and everything. And he's describing his whole thing. He'd taken his brother-in-law who hated it, you know, he was just really happy to be back home. But Jumahan really liked this. And he said, he told the people there, he said, when I arrived in Delhi, I became a Kharaji, a foreigner. And everybody in the guest house said, Jumahan, he's a Kharaji, pointing to me. Yeah, foreigner.
Yeah.
You can't be a Kharaji. You're a Dokhali. You're a native. And Jumahan said, when one leaves his own country, he becomes a foreigner. And everybody said, Tuba, Tuba. They had never thought that Kharaji was actually a malleable. If you left your own country, you became a Kharaji. As far as they were concerned, Afghans were Dokhali and everybody else was Kharajis. And so I said later, you know, maybe we should call the whole country Dokhalistan or something. Is that they recognize we're locals. This is us, and there's these Kharajis of different varieties, and it was that fundamental commonality that I saw is that's what holds people together.
I mean, given the history of the country with so much blood, not just, there's so much blood among the Pashtuns, among the sub-tribes of the Pashtuns to keep the power that they believe is theirs, and also the amount of blood that needed to be spilled to keep others at bay. And the whole idea of Afghanistan is now a contested, the identity in itself is contested. And you said earlier that when you first went to Afghanistan, anyone you saw were Afghans. But the past, 5 decades have changed Afghanistan enormously. That, for the identity politics of Afghanistan, I suppose, we're not very different from the rest of the world in that sense. But the whole idea of Afghanistan, do you think it's been a failed experiment?
No, because I don't think the people who lived in Afghanistan thought they were living in an experiment. It's their rulers that were living in experiments.
Mm.
And it was the Afghan people that suffered. All right. Bringing in ideas, I don't care whether it's Islamist ideas, communist ideas, democratic ideas, bringing in these ideas and not attempting to sell them to their people, or not having enough patience to say, if our ideas are so good, within a generation, the new generation will laugh at the prejudices of the older generation. They didn't have the confidence to do that. And consequently, and the other thing too, whether it was the communists or the Republic, they relied on international armies to enforce their writ. If you're the ruler, then you don't need to compromise with your own people because you can't be thrown out of power. If you turn to, look what happened to Najib after the Soviets left. Suddenly, he abolished the Communist Party. He called it the Watan Party. He began giving speeches. He went up to Mazar Sharif for Nowruz. And my student Omar Sharifi has transcripts of these speeches in which he cites Quranic verses. He cites hadiths. He calls the Mujahideen in Peshawar radical Islamists in the pay of Pakistan who are not real Afghans and are not properly Muslims because they're opposed to things like shrines and pilgrimages and other things that are common to Afghan Islam. This was a guy, and he changed his name from Najib to Najibullah.
Mm.
This was a person who...
And the nickname, where that came from? I mean, Najib Gal, where does that come from?
Well, the bull.
Yeah, the bull.
Because he was an excellent orator, and he had that. There was Frederick Barth, a colleague of mine, Norwegian anthropologist who worked in SWAT, compared leadership. This was among the Pashtuns. He said there's two models of leadership. There's the lion model of the Han, big mustache, big guy, booming voice. And then he says, and then there's the model of the fox, which is usually religious leaders.
Mm.
These guys trim their mustaches. They mumble. You can barely hear them. They wear poor-looking clothing. Two different ways to get political power. If you look at the first interviews that we saw in the West with Osama bin Laden, he's mumbling. He's looking at the ground and he's not shouting, Islam will win. And some guy says, yeah, he's at war with the West. Mumble, mumble, mumble. And then there's the military leader, the powerful Han. That guy says, I am powerful, just look at me. And Najib had that model. Ashraf Ghani, one of his problems was he tried to act in the Han mode, which is physically, he and I are both small people, kind of, and you put a big hat on that kind of person, big robes, and you get an Afghan mini-me. I mean,
He
it
was a
doesn't have,
fox roaring as if he was a lion.
well, if he knew he was a fox, he'd still be in power. All right. Acting like a lion when you weren't. There's many proverbs in
When you were
Persian.
not even a fox.
Yes. Well, we won't go too far with the metaphors, but it's the type. There's different ways of getting power in Afghanistan, and you talked about the amount of bloodshed in Afghanistan. That's true at particular periods, but if you look at, I was just there at the end, but after the Civil War of 1929, there's no bloodletting in Afghanistan. There's only one minor rebellion in Kunar. I mean, it's quiet for 50 years. It's quiet. And after the bloodshed of Amir Abdurrahman in the 1890s, up until 29, it's also quiet. But unfortunately, and again, Daoud has a coup. There's no trouble. He declares it a republic, but he's the king's cousin. Yeah, so you want to do that, that's fine. But starting with the communist Afghanistan over sort of the past 40 years, yeah, remarkable bloodletting. But people have projected that in the past and say, and particularly foreigners, oh, that's just the way the Afghans do things. Actually, even if you look at the Anglo-Afghan wars, very few people were killed, in part because the battles took place only in a few regions. They weren't in the entire country. And the British were only there for 2 years, so they got out. It's in late 20th century and into the 21st century that Afghanistan gets a reputation for bloodletting, in part because, I mean, the Soviets killed 1 million Afghans, made 4 or 5 million refugees. And if you start there, you say, yeah, well, it's that kind of country. It wasn't that kind of country before that. And again, we have that sort of Russian attitudes towards counterinsurgency, kill everybody and pave it over. We see that in Ukraine. We see that. I was like, this is really old, goes back to the czars and other things. It's a very different way of dealing with it. But that left Afghanistan, remarkably damaged. And the United States and its allies did not step in after the Najib regime collapsed, or even while it was there, to create a government that was more broad-based. Instead, it outsourced to Pakistan, and we got a civil war. So Afghanistan has a history of remarkable bloodshed during the Soviet period in the 80s, and then gets hit with a civil war right after, which brings out the worst instincts in Afghanistan. That's when we begin to see sort of war crimes everywhere, massacres, just horrible things happening. And too many outsiders say, yeah, well, that's how the Afghans do business. But I would say that's not how the Afghans do business. Is at these various periods of crisis, this comes up, but it's actually a failure of order that normally exists in Afghanistan. And to some extent, that is exacerbated when there are foreign troops there, because Afghans are pretty good at coming to deals among themselves, because nothing is permanent. We can have another deal later. But foreign intervention has led to much more sort of radicalization and a belief that you could call on the outside to help you out. And that's led to considerably more violence than there was in the past. Because I never saw a gun in Afghanistan. I mean, I wasn't in Eastern Afghanistan, but in Northern Afghanistan, I bought a Russian shotgun to bring with me, and I was the best armed person there. It was just a hunting. But I never saw a gun, never saw any violence in the whole time I was there. Despite the lack, there were no police. There was no government agents. But people managed to maintain order themselves without too much difficulty.
Throughout its recent history, the way the rulers have ruled Afghanistan, as you said, as I mentioned earlier, the two large Pashtun families scheming against each other. But that took a lot of that do require a lot of energy to continuously carry on that fight. but also to continue to keep the other ethnic groups, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks at bay. That has fed into this idea of the future of Afghanistan. Do you see the country as it is, with the Taliban as its rulers, and with a lot of damage that Ashraf Ghani did, and also, his Pashtun-centric ideas and overtly Ahmadzai, centered attitudes towards not just to other ethnic groups, but of course towards Southern Pashtuns. But I wanted to, Professor Barfield, if you could open up a bit the idea of the Ghilzai and the Durrani rivalries in the context of where we are now, and also what Afghanistan, whether the whole thing with the Taliban and the damage that they're doing to the country, to the whole idea of Afghanistan, and the contested notion of Afghanness, who is an Afghan, and the consequences of that questions. So is the idea of Afghanistan actually sustainable? Can Afghanistan remain as it is?
Well, I would say, look, it's a bit smaller, but it's remained as it was since 1747. It used to rule Mashhad, it used to rule Lahore, it lost all of that, it used to rule Baluchistan. But if you look at the only country that has a longer history in that region is Iran. And in my new book, Shadow Empires, I think when you look at the Abbasid dynasty and you look at Abu Muslim, it's the Khorasani dynasty. Now, the Iranians keep referring to, oh, it's Eastern Iran. But if you look at it, the Barkamids, the famous viziers, they were from Balkh. And the power of that regime in Baghdad came from Khorasan. What we call Afghanistan is, I think, one of the problems. And again, this goes to thinking, and there's a lot of debate calling it Afghanistan. I mean, anytime you call a country a name that has an ethnic group, it creates a problem. I live in the United States. That's kind of easy because there's no Mr. America. You can call anybody American kind of because it was a made-up term. Same thing with Canadian. It's a little bit more difficult with French or German.
Yeah.
Who have this idea of blood, culture, language, whatever, okay? The thing is that the British, early on, they didn't call it Afghanistan, they called it the Kingdom of Kabul. And this idea, a national state, is pretty much, that's a 20th century kind of thing. We see it in the 20s because Iran, Turkey, post-World War I, they're all developing this.
But just an interruption, sorry. Where does this whole idea of Afghanistan actually came from? I mean, when was it used first?
The British began to use it in the 19th century, causing it, their first encounter, as I say, Stuart Elphinstone's book is called The Kingdom of Kabul and Its Dependencies. In the Anglo-Afghan Wars, they began calling it Afghanistan. But again, also remember, most of their fight was actually in the Pashtun areas, kind of. So, but they weren't thinking in national terms. After all, the British were building an empire, right? So, it's their naming of these kind of things was, they weren't concerned about labeling here, but there were a bunch of labels to choose from. And again, one of the things I wrote in the first edition of the book is that why national histories of Afghanistan have no history before 1747. Why? Because there's no Pashtuns. The Pashtuns since 1747 have claimed we have a right to rule Afghanistan. It's Afghanistan, land of the Afghans, or we're the dominant group. But name me a Pashtun dynasty before 1747. Name me a Pashtun sultan, emir, whatever. Zero. Okay? They're not there. They are Persians. They are Turks. They are Mongolians. All people that are in Afghanistan today at one point actually were elements of a ruling minority that took control of the state. But their control of the state was dynastic, because rulers did not see themselves as representatives of people. They were representatives of a royal house. And they did as much damage to their own people who might challenge that as they did to other people. Even Emir Abdurrahman, right? We focus on the horrible things he did to the Hazarajat, but before he did that to the Hazarajat, he went after the Ghilzais. He even used some Hazara troops down there. He went after them until he had crushed them. And then he turns around and said, all right, I'll give you land from the Hazarajat. He switches. But the one thing, he was not fighting in the name of Pashtuns. He was fighting in the name of himself. He was using ethnicity. He was using regions as tools. But he still had this old dynastic way of looking at it. And you talked about disputes between rival dynasties in Afghanistan. If we look at the civil wars, they're almost entirely among relatives. That a civil war in 19th century Afghanistan never involved many people, regular people. It involved members of the dynasty. British invasions, First and Second Anglo War, yeah, they do involve the mobilization of a lot of people, particularly in rural areas. But political histories focus on challenges between the descendants of Dost Muhammad or the Sadozais versus the Barakzais. But if you look at that, those are two small clans that fight for dominance. And everybody else sits to see, okay, who's going to win? And once they win, we'll establish a relationship with them. And that's a pre-modern way of looking at politics. And in the modern period, people take that and say, oh, these are the founders of the nation. You know, that Ahmad Shah Durrani becomes Baba, you know, the founder of Afghanistan. No, he was the founder of a dynasty, and all the territory that he had, he did not conquer it himself. He inherited after his patron, Nader Shah Afshar, an Iranian Turk, died, was assassinated. And he took over the eastern half of the empire. Great empire, but it's not one that the Pashtuns captured or conquered. They were, it's like you inherit a great fortune and you declare yourself an entrepreneur. If we look at
and you have the Kohinoor diamond in your bag as well. And you have the Kohinoor diamond in your bag as well.
Yes, you do. And the British took that. Well, yeah. Actually, I believe it was actually the Sikhs who took that, and then the British took it from the Sikhs.
Yeah. So it came from actually so Nader Shah took it from the Mughals in India.
Correct.
Because the Mughals had it from the Sikhs, right?
No. The Mughals had it first. God knows where they.
Yeah. So the Mughal had it first.
They probably got it from some Hindu Raja. All right.
Yeah. And then took it to Iran. Nader Shah's died or killed or whatever happened around his tent. So Ahmad Shah Durrani was one of his commanders, or the lead of his bodyguards.
And so he had his treasury, and he ran.
And he just looted the treasury. So you can argue that the Afghanistan story really began with a big loot, right?
But I think this is trying to tell the story of a nation in a world that there were no nations.
Yes.
We project in the past on these. And that's not the way those people saw it. And it's not the way they acted. And they were tough on their own people. And even if we look at Ahmad Shah Durrani, they're talking about being elected by a jirga. I mean, this is a very common thing, whether it's Caesar, Chinese, usurpers, or others, is it's polite to refuse the throne 3 times. Oh, who, me? Oh, not me. 3rd time you take it. All right.
No, King Charles didn't do that.
The offer is legitimate, but you don't say, oh, you don't want it, we'll give it to your cousin. No, that's not going to happen. But there's certain ways of doing it, and Ahmad Shah Durrani does not see himself as the founder of a nation. He is the founder of a dynasty, a very successful dynasty. But the interesting thing about Afghanistan is that dynasty is thrown out of power by the Barakzais, by Dost Muhammad.
Mm.
But the way Afghans interpret it, particularly if you're a non-Pashtun, it's unbroken, right? But if you look carefully, why does Dost Muhammad call himself an emir and not a shah? Because he's not a Sadozai. That would be illegitimate. He attacks Peshawar and declares himself an emir because he's led a jihad. And that title, emir, is used all the way down to Amanullah, who calls himself king. And it is only after Nader takes power, calls himself Nader Shah. Because hell, if the Iranians are going to have a Shah, he's going to be. But Afghans at this point have forgotten that actually that lineage is not entitled to the Shah. But also, he picked Shah because Amanullah is a legitimate regent. So he better take a fancier title if he wants to establish his dynasty. And of course, he's assassinated, so it's only partially successful. But his brothers, his son, they rule for the next 40 years. But if you follow the titles, if you follow this, what you can see is none of these people are mobilizing a nation. None of them are mobilizing a political ideology. They're taking advantage of traditions in which people assume that the ruler is not going to be one of them. Somebody has to rule. This goes back to Thomas Hobbes. A state in anarchy is dangerous for everybody. And again, if we look at the Pashtuns are famously egalitarian, particularly the ones in the East. So how can you possibly have a royal Pashtun dynasty? Pashtuns don't believe in royalty. Where do they pick that up? Is Ahmad Shah Durrani works for Nader Shah Afshar. The Turks do have an idea of royal dynasties, the descendants of Genghis Khan, the descendants of Tamerlane, the descendants of Babur. And it's the Sadozais proclaim, we are the Pashtun royal dynasty. The other Pashtuns do not believe that such a royal dynasty exists. But if you say, well, if not them, then who? They can't come up with anybody else. So after every Anglo-Afghan war, even though it was the Eastern Pashtuns and the Kohistanis that got rid of the British, they always go back. Dost Muhammad comes back. He's lost the country, he's surrendered, he's given it back again. And similarly, Abdurrahman comes in, he signs an agreement with the British, he becomes a ruler. But none of them mobilized the Afghan population to get their positions. Now, they write their histories a little bit differently, but if we look at it, what we can see is why did the other Afghans, particularly the Pashtuns, put up with this? Is because we need some kind of central authority. These people have been a royal dynasty for a long time, and Karzai even fill that role. And they're really opposed to devolving power to Uzbeks, to Tajiks, to Hazaras. So it's got to be a Pashtun. If it's got to be a Pashtun, there's the least argument about going back to a clan that had this old history. It has a dynastic charisma. And also because particularly with the Barakzais and others, until you get to Abdurrahman, they cut deals with local elites. Look at Shir Ali's son, who was the governor of Herat. He leads a revolt against his own father before the Second Anglo-Afghan War. A lot of his army is Herati. Wait a minute, he's a Pashtun, he's a member of the royal, yeah, but his power comes from his local control. Similarly, Abdurrahman's other cousins, I believe it was Yusuf, if I remember, who was ruling in Balkh and Mazar Sharif. They actually proposed at the time that there'd be 5 kings of Afghanistan. Everybody should get his own region because all their fathers had been emirs before. Why not divide it up? Abdurrahman wipes them all out. When he wipes them all out, he also needs to wipe out the history of their legitimacy. So a lot, I think, of what modern Afghans look back is they're responding to a history that was written by Pashtun nationalists, but in fact never really existed on the ground. That, with the exception of Abdurrahman, who creates it, but he does not create He's not creating a Pashtun state because he beat up on them as much as others, but he needs their cooperation. And the Hazars are the great victims, of that. But if you look at it, it is a very different kind of consolidation of a state than we see in the unification of Italy or the unification of Germany, which focused on the dominance of one ethnic group. In
And how
Afghanistan,
do you see the same, intertribal pattern being played by, inside the Taliban and the way they rule? Because, it's a never-ending thread of Pashtun rule. This scheming, sub-scheming, tribes, sub-tribes, intricacies, rivalries, betrayal, allegiances. So how do you observe it now as it's played now?
well, it's too soon to tell. All right, the Taliban are there. Predicting what's going to happen in Afghanistan, I think, is a job for fools because you're always going to be wrong.
Mm.
Wait and see what happens, and then people say, "Oh, it obviously had to happen that way." Well, if that obviously had to happen that way, why did it take everybody by surprise? Right? What we see is factions. I mean, it's surprising that the Taliban have kept their structure of the 1990s so much in that the ruler of the country lives in Kandahar and is never seen. What kind of ruler is that? All right. The guys that we do see, the Zadrans that are in Kabul, they're not clerics. They represent, if you will, a Pashtun tribal tradition. On the other hand, a lot of the Zadrans, their mothers were Arabs, so they had these more international connections. But what strikes me is the Republic fell not because of armies coming out of Jalalabad and Kandahar. It fell after Herat and Mazar collapsed. It was taken from the north and from the west. Those are non-Pashtun territories. Yeah, there were Taliban, but who are those people? And are they getting their share of power? My guess is they're not. And at which point are they going to say is, hey, we're part of the victors too, but also because they disagree with the conservatives in Kandahar, particularly about women's education or other things, is they're not necessarily as ideological. And they're not necessarily, and this is what I don't really know, what are the ones in the north and the west, Herat and Mazar, to what extent are they purely Pashtun and to what extent they're multi-ethnic? I just don't know. But we haven't seen these conflicts so far, but they could arise precisely because the people that helped bring down the republic seem to have gotten the least out of it. That is Herat and Mazar.
And of course,
Kandahar
you
is,
had the Tajiks in Badakhshan as well. So they had they had formed a big force for the Taliban. Now, that is quite an interesting thing because you've previously rejected the idea of Balkanization of Afghanistan,
yes,
Yugoslavia.
yes,
But given where we are, given the manner with which the Taliban rules, 21st century, the age of the internet, social media, and of course, reclamation of identities, people refounding themselves, reclaiming their past identities, rewriting their stories. Hazaras have their own story to tell now,
yes,
independent of other authors or whoever wrote in the past. And the Tajiks do their own narrative, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, they all have this sense of nationhood in themselves. Some even have flags for themselves. The Tajiks do that. And there are, tricolor Hazara flags springing out, on social media. And of course,
right.
Uzbek might have their own thing. So these are the green shoots of ideas that's springing up across Afghanistan, I think. But, how do you see that? And that when I ask, is Afghanistan sustainable in the way it is now? I'm just asking, considering all these things now, the realities on the ground now, the balkanization, I mean, does it come to your thinking now?
No, no offense to you and your compatriots, but I see the idea of independent nations for Afghanistan, of breaking it up, much more common in the expatriate community on the internet than I believe exists in Afghanistan. and this is not unusual, you know, in terms of expatriates leading nationalist revolts or national ideas of nationalism. Sometimes they have more freedom to do it. Some of the most, you know, I live in Boston, we have a large Irish community, and they were the most in favor of, you know, Irish Republican Army, like throwing the British out, uniting Northern Ireland, you know, and you go to an Irish bar and they would collect money. And you think, well, wait a minute, the IRA is bombing places, they're killing people. But they were romantically looked at as in Boston.
Mm.
People didn't have to live with the
Yeah.
consequences of that. But the great irony is that if there's going to be reunification of Ireland, it's likely because of Brexit. Is that Northern Ireland, and the fact that probably is that you've got a generations coming up that no longer care this Protestant Catholic division. It just seems to be stupid.
Yeah.
And the bigger thing is maybe, you know, not that we're all Irish, but purely practical, you know, if given the tax situation and others, we might be better off being part of the EU. It's a democratic state, you know, we're going to be represented. That happens.
Opportunities, the young people, opportunities, future.
Well, Afghanistan has one of the youngest populations in the world, right? If it learns anything, if it looks at the Balkans, what it could see is there is no end to breaking up a multi-ethnic society. There's no place to stop. Every time one group says we should be free of oppression, and okay, you give them a state, then you find a littler ethnic group that says, what about us? We can have two villages getting their own nation. But the main thing I think is, and again, I think that the idea of breaking things up goes against, if you will, the practicalities of Afghanistan. Afghanistan lives in a tough neighborhood. If you had an independent Herat or an independent northern Afghanistan, it would be dominated by the Iranians. It would be dominated by, you know, the Uzbeks. And even if you look at Afghanistan's push for Pashtunistan, it was always unclear, well, what's Afghanistan's? The Afghan government in the from the 50s, really from the beginning of Pakistan, talks about an independent Pashtunistan, but its Pashtuns are entitled to their own state within Pakistan. They never talk about a greater Afghan state, because then the Afghan Pashtuns would be a minority. That wouldn't be so good for them. So they're interested in a nation state, an ethnic nation state in Pakistan that they're not willing to have for themselves. They're not really, you know, where do Pashtuns go on that? But if you break it up, all right, in terms of even the Pashtuns, you say, okay, should there be a Pashtun state within Afghanistan? Then you would find the differences between the East and the South. Great. So much that, and this was true during the Soviet period and the Civil War period, there wasn't a single politician in Afghanistan that ever said a solution to our problem is to become independent or to join, like the Tajiks, join with Tajikistan, the Uzbeks with Uzbekistan. In order to build that kind of emphasis, you've got to have politicians in Afghanistan that build and sell an idea that we not only deserve our national state, that this would be better for us. And the interesting thing is, the people I see pushing this are outside of Afghanistan. That inside Afghanistan, it's always questions of, let's have a multi-ethnic state, but renegotiate the arrangements within the state. If, for example, as with the Republic, the president was all powerful and made all the, you know, appointments of governors. If you had a more federal system, would the Hazaras care as much whether there was a Pashtun ruling in the palace if they handled all their local affairs? Would the Uzbeks would be, yeah, so a Pashtun sits in Kabul, but we and our Tajik neighbor, we control Mazar. Herat says, yeah, we already see ourselves as a separate place, but not necessarily a separate nation. I point out the United States is one of the oldest federal republics in the world, and the states utterly disagree on how they should be ruled. In Texas, they want everybody to carry a gun. You get arrested in Boston if you carry a gun, because we don't believe that's a good thing. And I had argued somewhat jokingly with Afghan friends, they're saying Afghanistan, it's constant insurgencies. I said, well, if Barack Obama had put a black guy in Chicago to be governor of Mississippi and George Bush had sent his brother to rule Boston, and God help us if Donald Trump had set Ivanka to be governor of California, we would have an insurgency too. Is the fact of the way power is structured in Afghanistan makes it a zero-sum game. But that's the structure of the government. It looked at the structure in the 64 Constitution and the 2004 Constitution is the same, pretty much. But Zahir Shah never attempted to impose himself on the rest of the country the way Ashraf Ghani did, right? They would cut deals. You don't cause us trouble, we won't cause you trouble. Were almost all the officials Pashtun? Yes. But their job was to just maintain order. And if you want to rule effectively in a multi-ethnic place, you better come to an agreement with the important people in your area. So you do. So you change the structure. You've got a country. It's together, but it's not solved. What does an independent Hazarajat do when it's surrounded, a doubly landlocked country, surrounded by people that are potentially hostile to it? And the same thing could be said for other regions of Afghanistan. And I compared, when I first wrote it, I said, creating political systems in Afghanistan was like an arranged marriage, not a love match. A nationalism is a love match. Isn't this great? Aren't we all together? Governments in Afghanistan, people think they have no romantic illusions that you're going to like this, but they stay together for the children, right? And I think within Afghanistan, there's more a willingness to compromise. But Afghanistan has never had a large expatriate community until now. And so it picks up on what the rest of the world is, and particularly the rise of ethnic nationalism. But that was alien to Afghanistan before, and I'm still not sure that it's saleable within the country. There's certain parts of it, the intelligentsia, that, yeah, we'll buy into it, but I'm not sure it's a saleable solution.
But the whole idea of a federated Afghanistan, I mean, the mentioning of the whole idea, it's not a new thing. People have done it before. But the successive Pashtun rulers of the country have seen as a threat to the whole idea of Afghanistan, not just to the Pashtun rule. For them, it's either us ruling Afghanistan. If it's not us, there's not going to be an Afghanistan. So,
I would disagree with you there, because if the Pashtun said, all right, the rest of you guys don't like us, we're going to create a Pashtunistan, and the rest of the country calls itself Khorasan, I'm not so sure that the Easterners would join with the Southerners, in saying, yeah, we're separate. Because the interesting thing about Afghanistan is there's always, if you look for clean ethnic boundaries, there's always an exception. That if I say the Pashtun, the Taliban is Pashtun, people can give me 5 or 6 important people that are not. Mostly yes, but not. The fact is that every ethnic group has links with others. There's people within it that are able to cut deals with those people. And over time, it never created, no ethnic group will stand together against somebody else without the fear that a subgroup within it will do a deal on its own. And it's just, that's the way politics historically works in Afghanistan. I do not think, for example, if during the Bonn Accord, I believe the first proposed ruler out of the king's department was an Uzbek.
Yeah.
Right? It was the United States. It was the other said, no, it's got to be a Pashtun ruler. If some other ruler had been put in 2001, 2002, I don't think the Pashtuns would have objected. It's times they would have seen what are the consequences of this. But they were the losers, okay? They had supported the Taliban. It's amazing that the Tajiks, it's amazing that Fahim didn't move into the palace in Kabul and tell Karzai, I hope you have a return ticket. Because what did you do? The fact that the Northern Alliance that got rid of the Taliban was willing to accept a Pashtun is an example, I would say, about classic ways that ethnic groups go together. Is sometimes it's not worth arguing about who's at the top if you control the middle. And at that time, the Northern Alliance controlled the middle.
You've also said it as well in one of your lectures that since 1901, Afghanistan's had 14 rulers.
Yep.
And only one has survived, I suppose, his time in office. That even was possible with the colossal amount of, trillions of dollars of Western money. Karzai, even he barely survived. He had attempts on his life, his family's brothers killed. And now he's not really survived. He's in effectively house arrest in Kabul now. But why do Afghan rulers never learn?
Because each one thinks he's an exception. I would say, maybe Zahir Shah learned because for the first 30 years of his reign, he wasn't in charge. It was his uncles or Dawood. Only for the 10 years between 63 and 73. He was in charge of his own. And then he gets thrown out, but there was absolutely no violence when Zahir Shah is overthrown. Dawood just steps in, everything just keeps running because that's the Colon Nafars, that's the big guys, that's their business. It doesn't affect, what people at the local level do. But the problem on it's not so much, it's since 1901. I mean, Amir Abdurrahman was the last ruler to die peacefully in bed while still ruling the country. The rest of them were assassinated or exiled. And Karzai is the only one. He's unique in another thing. He's the only one that ever stepped out of office, gave it up. I didn't think, the rumor was he'd have a Loya Jirga, he would cancel the election. No Afghan ruler has ever voluntarily stepped down from being ruler of Afghanistan. So there's many bad things you can say about Karzai. The fact that he did that was very unusual.
He kept his head.
Well, whatever he did, he's there, and the Taliban have taken over, but he's still alive. He's still there. He may be under house arrest. Interesting enough, Abdullah also stayed. They didn't shoot him. Ashraf Ghani is the one that overplayed his hand, and he had the great fear that he would not be treated so well, so he fled. But by fleeing, collapsed his government. All right. That's not an unusual thing. Nobody defended Kabul when the communists were there. The Mujahideen government didn't defend Kabul when the Taliban moved in. What was it, 95, 94? Massoud retreated.
96, I think.
Yeah, it was, I've written this many times. In Afghanistan, the perception of power itself. When people believe you have no power, you have no power. And there's a story the British collected, and this was in Uzbek area in northern Afghanistan, of an Uzbek emir who was in Kunduz. And he woke up one morning and no tea, no servants. And he looked all around the palace and nobody was there. He said he didn't know, the British said he didn't know what he had done, but he knew what it meant. He ran for the stable and got the fastest horse and left. And he was beheaded a mile out of town. But it was if nobody was in the palace, if nobody was protecting you, then you were not long for this world, politically and sometimes literally, physically. Is so much of leadership in Afghanistan is impression management. And if people believe you can do what you could do, you can continue on. If they don't, it turns out things collapse remarkably quickly. I mean, look at Amanullah. I mean, how could he lose to Habibullah Kalakani, a bandit from Kholistan? It just collapsed around him. Now, people could say, well, his army wasn't very strong, but that wasn't, you know, that was an amazingly fast collapse. So was the PDPA collapse in 92. And so was, you know, the Republic's collapse in 21. But it turns out that is much more, that is a pattern in Afghanistan. And if anything, a ruler should actually, I've said, if you put a portrait of all of those, I don't know, there's 14, there's so many I can't always remember. If you start with Habibullah and go all the way up, if those people are on the palace in Kabul and you're walking past them every morning, you know, that would be a salutary lesson to think, you know, this job is harder than it looks. And it didn't matter, you know, those were kings, those were presidents, those were party commissars, they were commanders of the faithful and presidents. Every one of them failed. So as I
Mullah
say, you know,
Haibatullah is no exception.
it remains to be seen, but you
But
know,
so, Professor, you know, if you've got two bags, one full of hopes, one full of fear, which side is heavier for you now at the moment about Afghanistan?
well, for me, it's because look, as you say, I've been looking at this for more than 50 years. It's more hope than fear because Afghanistan has been through really horrible stuff. All right. But the bigger thing, it has the youngest population in the world. And the United States is no good example. We got two old people that are running for president again.
How did you manage to do that? How did you manage to?
That's a good question. I'm not in charge of that. But if we look at it, is that population going to put up with this? I mean, one of the amazing things is you had women in street demonstrations. That's new. That's unusual. But the other thing, and I wrote about it in the second edition of my book, is for the first time, Kabul has major cities. All of these other periods, countryside versus cities, the cities were really tiny. Right? When I was in Kabul, you know, when Daoud took over, it was the biggest city in the country and had 500,000 people. People said, oh, that's the big city. That's, yeah. And that's nothing. How do you deal with a city that has a population density equal to Beijing, which is Kabul now? People that have 20 years of expectations that have just been dashed. Will they put up with it forever? I don't know. Afghan history tells me probably not. But Afghan history also tells me that the Taliban are likely to face something surprising. What if a riot breaks out in Kabul? Could they put it down? And if they can't put it down, do people think maybe they're not as strong as we think? Is anybody planning that? Probably not. But I remember, I think it might have been 2006, there was an American military convoy coming across the road down from the Intercontinental Hotel, and it was speeding and it killed an Afghan bicyclist. And a riot broke out. And it spread. The police took off their uniforms and they joined the rioters. And they went all the way down to the gates of the palace. And that riot was only put down because they called in the army. So that was a period of like nothing really going on, no big thing. But Kabul was such a tinderbox that it blew up and it frightened Karzai. Karzai never forgot that. His population of Kabul coming for him. The interesting thing was 2 days later, nothing seemed to have happened and it never happened again. But if you're the ruler in the palace, you might not be so lucky the next time, particularly if you're like a Taliban ruler and you're looked upon as religiously different, ethnically different than the population of Kabul, that they really have it in for you, because they didn't have it in for Kabul, I mean, for Karzai particularly. But they came close to taking down his regime almost by accident. And there was no insurgency in the country, right? So if you turn to Herat or you turn to Mazar or some other place, what happens if there's a demonstration and some Taliban thinks, well, we'll put it down by shooting people. That'll teach them.
I mean, at the moment, there's something going on in Badakhshan, for example, in
It
districts.
could,
People,
I mean, that's,
yeah,
yeah, that's a remote mountainous
yeah, yeah.
kind of, and that's where Afghan rulers traditionally look. Trouble in the countryside, all right? Because historically, that's where trouble has come from. Where trouble has never come from in Afghanistan, usually, is the cities. The only time it did happen was in the first Anglo-Afghan War, when a mob burned down Alexander Burns's house, killed him, killed his brother, and began the insurgency that drove the British out. But it was totally by accident. It was only after that happened that the insurgency got started. All right. What people took as inevitable, of course, the British are occupying Kabul. They're occupying this, of course, will happen. Didn't look like that at the time. The British thought they had everything under control. Now, if you look closely, you can see the British had stopped paying their subsidies. The Ghilzais, were angry at them. Shah Shuja was not doing a great job. But at the time, it looked like everything was fine. So for a couple of years, the Taliban said, looks like everything is fine. The question is, what happens when something unexpected happens? And the unexpected thing is largely in Afghanistan cities. I mean, who would have predicted that Afghanistan would get a communist government and that Iran would get an Islamist government after the Shah? It's almost like God sent angels and they got their instructions mixed. It is like, here's a message. Go to Tehran and you'll have the first Soviet republic. And go to Afghanistan, they're good on religion. And somehow the messages got mixed up, because never was a country, like, I would say, less primed for a socialist revolution than Afghanistan, as opposed to Iran, which had a communist party come back in the 20s. So in retrospect, we look at these things and we talk about them as inevitable because they happened. So when we're looking at something now, we take periods of quiet as, well, must not be a problem. But look at Afghanistan's economic problems. Look at its isolation. Not a single country has recognized it. How long can this go on? I don't know.
I mean, but does that even, given where the world is at the moment, with all the flashpoints around us, Russia, China, I mean, Putin's in Beijing at the moment.
Yes.
You've got the, at least, regional powers are providing a sense of protection for the group, quasi recognition. You can name it whatever you want, but there is a semblance of recognition by the regional actors there, and which they didn't have in the previous time. I mean,
well, they actually had 3 countries recognize them.
Yeah, but the world was an entirely different place. Russia was not doing it. China was not doing it.
No. But the United States never thinks it's going to be back in Afghanistan. On the other hand, it never expected to go to Afghanistan in the first place. But look at that ISIS terrorist attack in Moscow. The perpetrators were Tajiks, but they were recruited by ISIS Khorasan, which is based in Afghanistan. What if that had happened in the United States? Now, the United States might not want to go back to Afghanistan and create a new state, but look at what it did at ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It says, okay, we'll go into northern Afghanistan. We'll go into Hazarajat. We won't be concerned with what kind of government there's in Kabul. We'll just be going after the Islamic State with as many Afghan allies as we can get, as the United States uses the Kurds in northern Iraq and Syria. As much as I would say it's a very remote chance, but you could see the United States back there. But this time it would not be nation building.
No.
And similarly, look at the Russians. You know, they think, okay, let's, Taliban, that looks good. And they suffer the worst terrorist attack they've had in what, 25 years? How do they respond to that, particularly if it looks to be worse, that more stuff is coming. They're vulnerable fighting, on the Ukrainian front, and even the Chinese. I mean, they're persecuting Muslim Uyghurs who are kind of non-offensive and trying to make friends with a group that is their worst nightmare. I mean, how does Xi Jinping work that out? The very Muslims that you are trying to suppress in Xinjiang, you're trying to support in Afghanistan. What makes you think they're not
And
going to
do you
turn on?
feel Pakistan feels Pakistan feels its hands being burnt by the
Yes,
climate that are not?
it's already had its hands burnt. Is that all the people that would like to do more jihad, the Taliban have said, yeah, why don't you go to Pakistan? Many of you are Pakistanis anyway. This is not what Pakistan expected in what it saw as a victory. It should have. Afghans make very bad clients. Pakistan, the United States would not have invaded Afghanistan if Mullah Omar had turned over Osama bin Laden. And Pakistan said, do it. We don't want the Americans here. Because you've got to follow the timeline. But the Bush administration did not accuse the Taliban of being terrorists in the beginning. They said it's Al Qaeda is the terrorist. You turn them over, and we don't care what you do in Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis were, do it. And he didn't. But that's the kind of thing that, again, everything that now Pakistan has to fear that the Taliban will once again link up with Delhi. That Kabul and Delhi have always had good relations as opposed to Kabul, Islamabad, regardless of the ideology of the government in Kabul. What a horrible thing for Pakistan. You think, we finally have strategic depth. And they're the Indians coming in the back door and the Taliban looking at the road that goes to Charbahar and saying, hey, that looks pretty good. We don't need Pakistan.
Mm.
It's a different world, but Pakistan has always underestimated or overestimated its ability to control conditions in Afghanistan. It's all well and good to support insurgents as they did against the Soviets or against the Americans. It's a whole nother thing when the clients that they've supported are in power themselves, at which point they're not interested at all in what Pakistan is concerned with.
Now,
Nobody
Professor, I'm so grateful for the generosity of your time. And I always tend to end this. You've covered so much, and I'm so grateful as if sitting in a class and you're listening to you. My head already feels a lot bigger, and I'm so grateful for that. But to end this with, as I normally do, with given your long association, your love for the country and its people, if you were to share an anecdote that I don't know you're having your chai sabs or if you're a wine drinker or a whiskey person, so whatever, or you're having your steak that you want to share an anecdote about Afghanistan that makes you laugh, that makes you feel good about the country, as far back as you want to go, as recent as you want to make it, but just on an upbeat note that you want to share the story.
Oh, since you mentioned whiskey, it's always considered haram in Afghanistan, but many Afghans drink, even in the provinces where. So I'll tell you a story there. Is I was a Fulbright student, so I had access to the American commissary, so I could buy whiskey. So I would bring bottles to my host, and we pour it, we drink, get drunk quick. He complained that this wasn't very much fun. Why were we? And I said, that's because we're drinking it improperly. And I said, so we had Seagram 7, blended whiskey. So we went to the bazaar and ordered Sprite and poured the Sprite into the whiskey and began drinking it. And he said, "This is really good. It's not as harsh, and you can sip on it." And he said, "It looks just like tea. I mean, you could do this in public." Anyway, so we're drinking this, and a few weeks later, I come back from the village, and there on our front veranda, all our carpets are out,
Mm.
pillows. I said, "What's this?" He says, "Well, I've invited the sub governor, the border commissar, the police chief. They're all coming." I mean, these are people I had avoided meeting. I don't. Don't worry about it. So they arrived and they said, "Ah, you all know Thomas as well. We've heard of him." And in front of each of them is one of those French Duralex glasses that Afghans
Yeah.
drink tea. So as our servant come out, pour a little bit of Seagram 7 in each one, and everybody had a bottle of Sprite next to them. And he says, "Oh, now, gentlemen, pour your Sprite now." "Seth, this is really good." And the governor said, "Yeah, if I was watching a parade, I could put this in a teapot and just like nobody would know." And so everybody had a good time. And they sort of said, "Don't worry, you won't be arrested. Like you're a good friend of ours." And they all left. So 2 days later, um, I'm coming back from the village. The sun is going down over the Oxus River. It's the
Yeah.
summer, it's hot. And and now Seth comes back from his engineering job at Spinsar Company and says, "I think it's time for mixed drinks." And I said, "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." So we get the whiskey out, and he tells the servant, he says, "Bacha, bazaar, bro, go to the bazaar, get us some Sprite." And he comes back and he says, "Sab, there is no Sprite. It's sold out." And we realized, man, we had introduced this, and we're at the end of the supply line, so there was no Sprite. And so he says, but they do have Coca-Cola and they do have Fanta. And so Asaf said to me, "Well, can we mix that?" And I had to think about that. I said, "Well, never Fanta." I said, "Mixing it with 7-Up with Sprite," I said, "that's halal. Mixing it with Fanta, that's
That's
haram."
not.
Okay. However, in a pinch, we can pour it in a Coca-Cola, and that's makruh. Okay, it's not
That's an
great, but we can do it.
emergency.
And so not only did I introduce mixed drinks to that part of Afghanistan,
But
but
you made
I gave it
Coca-Cola and whiskey
an Islamic
mackerel
characterization about. I said, unlike Russian vodka, I said you could pour Russian vodka into
on
Fanta.
anything. But whiskey
and
is a sacred drink. Whiskey is a sacred drink.
yes, so it was better with the light stuff. Coca-Cola was okay, but never with that orangey.
And what about
Fanta stuff.
Chars?
Uh, the people that I live with, it actually, they didn't smoke because they were concerned that people would take advantage of them. But Kunduz province, particularly the northern part, Dashte Archi, that was like the Champagne region of chars.
Yeah.
They had the best chars in Afghanistan. And I wasn't a big smoker, but my wife was. She was a charsi. So when she spent most of it studying Buddhism in India and Dharamsala with the Dalai Lama school. But anyway, when she came back to Afghanistan to do nomad migration, and my Afghan friends heard she was coming, and they heard she was a Charsi, they went to the Dashti Archi, they rolled their own stuff. And when they presented it to her, she said, "Okay, this
is good stuff."
Expectation." So they felt, "Oh, we are the best hosts in all of Afghanistan," because particularly when it comes to the needs of a hanum, a lady, you've got to go.
Yeah.
And so those were very pleasant times to.
Oh, Thomas Barfield, thank you ever so much. I'm so grateful. It's been such a privilege listening to you, and love reading you. Love your wisdom. Afghanistan's lucky to have people who love it, who studies it as much as you do, who cares about its future as much as you do. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.